scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked around the room. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but there was an unsettling silence that made her skin crawl. George was still sleeping peacefully in his bed, clutching his beloved dinosaur toy. Peppa decided to wake him up, but when she reached over to shake his shoulder, her hand passed right through him. She gasped and tried again, but the same thing happened. George was there, but somehow he wasn't really there at all. Confused and frightened, Peppa ran downstairs to find Mummy and Daddy Pig. The house felt eerily quiet as her footsteps echoed through the hallways. When she reached the kitchen, she found her parents sitting at the breakfast table, but they weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, their eyes wide open, staring straight ahead with blank expressions on their faces. Peppa called out to them, but they didn't respond. She waved her hands in front of their faces, but they remained motionless like statues. Their breakfast sat untouched on the table, growing cold. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each tick seeming louder and more ominous than the last. Desperate for answers, Peppa ran outside to find her friends. The playground was empty, but she could hear children laughing in the distance. Following the sound, she discovered all her friends playing together, but when she approached them, they couldn't see or hear her. She was invisible to everyone she cared about. As the day progressed, Peppa realized she was trapped in a world where she existed but didn't belong. She could see everything happening around her, but she couldn't interact with anyone or anything. The familiar places of her childhood had become a prison of loneliness and fear. The worst part came when night fell. As darkness crept across the town, the shadows began to move on their own. They stretched and twisted into impossible shapes, reaching out toward Peppa with long, grasping fingers. She ran through the empty streets, but the shadows followed her everywhere she went. Finally, Peppa found herself back in her bedroom, where George was still sleeping peacefully. She sat on her bed and began to cry, wondering if she would ever be able to touch her family again, or if she was doomed to wander this strange, isolated world forever. The shadows gathered around her window, pressing against the glass, waiting for their chance to take her away completely. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows across the walls. As she walked downstairs, she noticed the family portraits had changed. In each picture, the smiles were too wide, the eyes too bright. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but when she turned around, her usual warm smile had been replaced by something unsettling. Her teeth seemed sharper, and her eyes held a glint that made Peppa's stomach turn. "Good morning, my dear," Mummy Pig said in a voice with an odd echo. George was at the table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring at his plate with unblinking eyes. When Peppa called his name, he slowly turned his head, and she gasped. His face was the same, but something behind his eyes had changed completely. Daddy Pig emerged from behind his newspaper. His glasses reflected the light in a way that made it impossible to see his eyes. "What a lovely day for a family outing," he announced, though no one had mentioned going anywhere. The car ride felt endless. The familiar countryside had become a maze of identical trees that seemed to watch them pass. The radio played the same tune over and over, but the melody gradually became distorted. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were there, but they stood in perfect formation, not playing or laughing. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, and Pedro Pony turned to look at Peppa simultaneously, their movements synchronized. "Let's play a new game," Susie suggested, her voice carrying that same distant echo. The game involved standing in a circle and staring at the center, where nothing visible existed, but everyone seemed to see something that filled them with quiet joy. As the day progressed, Peppa noticed that time moved differently. Conversations would repeat exactly, but each time, the speaker's expressions became more intense. The playground equipment cast shadows that didn't match the sun, and those shadows moved independently. When evening came, the family returned home, but the house felt larger inside. Rooms appeared where hallways should be, and familiar furniture had been rearranged in impossible ways. The television showed the same program on every—
Scary Peppa Pig Episode 2, The Birthday Party That Never Ends. Today is Rebecca Rabbit's birthday party, and Peppa is very excited to go. Mummy Pig drives Peppa and George to Rebecca's house, which looks strangely different from usual. The windows are covered with dark curtains, and there are no other cars in the driveway. "Are we early, Mummy?" asks Peppa, looking at the empty street. "No, darling, you're right on time," Mummy Pig replies, but her voice sounds distant and hollow. Peppa and George walk up to the front door. When they knock, the door creaks open by itself. Inside, the house is dimly lit with flickering candles instead of normal lights. The decorations are all black and purple instead of the usual bright colors. "Hello, Rebecca?" calls Peppa, but there's no answer. They walk into the living room where they see all their friends sitting perfectly still around a birthday table. Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, Susie Sheep, and Candy Cat are all there, but something is wrong. They're not moving or talking, they just stare straight ahead with empty, glassy eyes. "Why isn't anyone talking?" whispers George, hiding behind Peppa. Peppa approaches the table. The birthday cake is covered in black frosting with candles that never seem to burn down. The same Happy Birthday Rebecca song plays over and over from an old music box, but it sounds distorted and slow. "Rebecca, are you okay?" Peppa asks, touching her friend's shoulder. Rebecca slowly turns her head toward Peppa. Her usual smile is gone, replaced by a blank expression. "The party never ends, Peppa," she says in a monotone voice. "We've been waiting for you." Suddenly, all the children turn to look at Peppa at the same time. Their eyes are completely black, and they all speak in unison. "Join us, Peppa. The party never ends." Peppa grabs George's hand and tries to run to the door, but it's locked. The windows won't open either. The birthday song keeps playing, getting louder and more distorted. "We can't leave." George starts to cry. The other children slowly stand up from their chairs and begin walking toward Peppa and George. They move in perfect synchronization, like dolls being controlled by invisible strings. "Don't be scared," says Pedro Pony, but his voice doesn't sound like Pedro anymore. "The party is so much fun. We play the same games forever and ever." Peppa notices that the room is getting smaller. The walls are slowly moving inward, and the ceiling is getting lower. The birthday decorations are changing too. The balloons are deflating and turning gray, and the streamers are falling like spider webs. "I want to go home," cries Peppa, but her voice echoes strangely, as if the room is much bigger than it appears. The music box suddenly stops playing. In the silence, Peppa can hear something else. The sound of children laughing, but it's coming from somewhere far away, like an echo from another world. Rebecca approaches Peppa with a birthday hat in her hands. "Put this on, Peppa. Then you can stay forever too." As Rebecca places the hat on Peppa's head, everything goes dark. When the lights flicker back on, Peppa is sitting at the birthday table with the others. She has the same blank expression and glassy eyes. George is the only one left standing, looking at his sister in horror. "Peppa," he whispers. Peppa slowly turns to look at George. "Join us, George," she says in the same monotone voice as the others. The party never ends. The birthday song starts playing again, and George realizes he's trapped in this endless birthday party where no one ever gets older, no one ever goes home, and the celebration never, ever stops. The camera slowly zooms out through the window, showing the house from outside. In every window, you can see the silhouettes of children sitting perfectly still around birthday tables, all celebrating parties that will never end. And somewhere in the distance, you can hear the faint sound of Happy Birthday being sung over and over again, forever.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa discovered an old music box in Grandpa Pig's attic. The delicate ballerina inside spun slowly to a haunting melody that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. When Peppa wound it up, the tune filled the house with an otherworldly sound that made everyone stop what they were doing. Mummy Pig found herself humming the melody without realizing it. Daddy Pig began tapping his fingers to the rhythm while reading his newspaper. Even little George started swaying to the music, his eyes growing distant and glassy. The melody was beautiful yet deeply unsettling, like a lullaby from another world. As night fell, the music box continued playing even though no one had wound it. The ballerina spun faster and faster, her painted smile seeming to grow wider with each turn. Peppa tried to close the lid, but it wouldn't budge. The melody grew louder, more insistent, calling to something hidden in the darkness. Strange things began happening around the house. Shadows moved independently of their owners. The family portraits on the walls seemed to watch with knowing eyes. The familiar rooms felt different, as if they were slowly transforming into something else entirely. The music was changing them all, note by haunting note. Peppa realized that the melody wasn't just playing from the music box anymore. It was coming from the walls, the floors, the very air itself. The house had become an instrument, and they were all trapped inside its song. The ballerina's dance was hypnotic, drawing them deeper into her eternal performance. One by one, the family members began to move like marionettes, their movements perfectly synchronized to the ghostly waltz. Their eyes reflected the same painted smile as the tiny dancer. They were becoming part of the music box's collection, forever trapped in its beautiful, terrible dance. As dawn approached, the melody finally began to fade. But Peppa noticed something chilling in the morning light. There were new figures in the music box alongside the ballerina, tiny versions of her family, forever spinning to the haunting tune, waiting for the next curious child to wind them up and join their endless dance. The music box sat silent on the shelf, its lid finally closed. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, you could still hear the faint echo of that otherworldly melody drifting through Grandpa Pig's house, calling to anyone brave enough to listen. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired on television. It was a rainy afternoon when Peppa and her family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's attic to look for old photo albums. The house felt unusually cold, and the wind outside made strange whistling sounds through the old wooden beams. Peppa climbed the creaky stairs first, followed by George, who clutched his dinosaur toy tightly. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb that flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows on the dusty boxes and forgotten furniture. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig stayed downstairs, saying they would join them later. As Peppa opened the first photo album, she noticed something odd. In every family photo, there was an extra figure standing in the background, a pig-like creature with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that she had never seen before. George pointed at the figure and whispered, "Who is that, Peppa?" But when Peppa looked closer, the figure seemed to move slightly in each subsequent photo, getting closer to the family. The temperature in the attic dropped suddenly, and their breath became visible in the cold air. The flickering light bulb began to swing back and forth, even though there was no wind inside. Peppa tried to call for Mummy and Daddy, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. George's dinosaur toy fell from his hands and rolled across the floor, making an unnaturally loud sound in the silence. As they turned the pages, the mysterious figure in the photos grew larger and more detailed. Its smile became wider, showing rows of sharp teeth, and its eyes seemed to follow them as they moved. In the final photo, the creature was standing right behind their family, its long arms reaching toward them with clawed fingers. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind them with a thunderous bang. Peppa ran to the door and tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The light bulb flickered faster now, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move in jerky, unnatural motions. George began to cry, but his tears were black as ink. From somewhere in the darkness of the attic, they heard a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. The photo albums began to flip their pages by themselves, faster and faster, until the pages were just a blur. The mysterious creature's laughter grew louder and more menacing. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they huddled together in the corner, watching as the shadows on the walls began to take shape. The creature from the photos was materializing in the attic with them, its form shifting between solid and shadow. It spoke in a voice that sounded like their own voices mixed together. "We've been waiting so long to play with you." The creature reached out toward them with impossibly long arms, and as it touched Peppa's shoulder, everything went black. When the light returned, Peppa and George found themselves alone in the attic, but something was different. Looking at their reflection in an old mirror, they saw that their eyes had become hollow and dark, just like the creature in the photos. From downstairs, they could hear Mummy Pig calling, "Peppa, George, come down for tea." But when they tried to respond, the same twisted laughter came from their mouths instead of their voices. They realized they had become part of the creature's collection, trapped forever in Grandpa Pig's attic, waiting for the next family to discover the photo albums and join them in their eternal game of hide and seek in the shadows.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George were getting ready for bed. Mummy Pig had just finished reading them their favorite bedtime story, and the children climbed into their bunk beds in their cozy blue bedroom, surrounded by familiar toys and drawings. But as soon as the lights went out, something strange began to happen. The toys on the floor started to move ever so slightly, as if they were breathing. George's beloved dinosaur toy turned its head toward the beds, its plastic eyes now gleaming with an unnatural light. The train set began to move along its tracks without anyone winding it up. Peppa noticed it first. When she looked at George, his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an expression she had never seen before. His usual cheerful smile was gone, replaced by something that made Peppa's stomach feel cold. The bedroom door began to creak as it slowly swung shut. But before it closed completely, Peppa saw something that made her heart race. Standing in the hallway was a figure that looked exactly like Mummy Pig, but something was terribly wrong. This version of Mummy Pig was too tall, her orange dress hanging strangely, and her usual warm smile had been replaced by a grin that stretched far too wide. The fake Mummy Pig began to speak, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted and echoing strangely. She was saying the same bedtime words she always said, but they felt different now, like a recording played backwards. The words seemed to wrap around Peppa like invisible chains. George sat up in his bed, but he moved like a puppet on strings, jerky and unnatural. When he turned to look at Peppa, his face had changed too. His eyes were now completely black, like deep holes, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper than they should be. He began to giggle, but the sound was wrong, too high and too long. The room itself started to change. The cheerful yellow walls began to fade to a sickly gray color, and the happy drawings on the walls started to move and twist. The picture of the sun grew dark clouds around it, and the drawing of their family began to show figures with no faces. Peppa tried to call for help, but when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. She realized that she was trapped in some kind of nightmare version of her own bedroom, where everything she loved had been replaced by something sinister. The fake George continued to giggle, and the fake Mummy Pig continued to speak her backwards bedtime words. As the night grew deeper, Peppa understood that this was not just a bad dream. Something had taken over her world, replacing everyone with twisted copies that looked right but felt completely wrong. The last thing she remembered was the sound of Daddy Pig's footsteps coming up the stairs. When morning came, everything appeared normal again. Mummy and Daddy Pig found Peppa and George sleeping peacefully in their beds. But Peppa knew the truth. She could see it in the way George looked at her when their parents weren't watching. The real family was gone, and only Peppa remembered what they used to be like.